Okay, second argument for the existence of gods, the teleological argument. You all know this one too, right? This is the design argument. This is there's beauty in the world, or there's a purpose to the world, or there's things that exist that are so complicated that could only have been explained by the existence of some sort of divine being, right? That's the idea. So this is an argument where they're not looking at, there has to have been a cause, right? They're not looking back and go, oh, stuff has to have come from somewhere. Rather, they're looking at the argument style here is you're looking at the way the world's built, or you're looking at some part of it. And you're saying the only way you get something like this is if there was like somebody intentionally doing it. So you're looking at things like, and teleology is just a fancy way of saying goal-based or purpose-based, right? So you're saying things have meaning, or things have such order or structure. People that look at the universe and go, "This is too beautiful. It must have been created by like a divine being or something." That's a teleological argument of that type, right? So purpose, order, things are too complex. They're too functional. All these suggest a designer. And that's the basic idea. Anytime somebody gives that kind of an argument for the existence of gods, they're giving you a design argument or a teleological argument. And the version of this argument that we're going to look at in this class is from Paley, right? So this is just Paley's watchmaker argument. One of the probably more influential versions of this argument. He just says, look, suppose you're walking on the beach and you come across a watch that's lying there in the sand. You pick up the watch, you notice the watch is super complicated. It's got all these little parts that work together and they perform a function, right? Um, how could that have possibly gotten there, right? And he says, well, people immediately go, oh, somebody must have had a watch in their pocket, right? And they must have dropped it. And that watch, that kind of thing, it's a machine, right? And you don't get a machine unless there's some sort of watch builder. And so the fact that there's a watch lying on the beach suggests that there must be a watch designer, right? There's an intelligent maker. There's a designer for the watch. And then Paley makes an analogy, right? And that's exactly what Paley's argument is. He says, just as there are watches, so there are eyeballs and there are people, right? So he says, just as a watch, a complicated designed artifact suggests a human designer. Likewise, the human eye, which is equally complicated, probably more complicated than a watch, right? Has all these little parts that do all sorts of things so that you can see stuff. That suggests that there must have been a designer for the eye, right? Therefore, God, or at least an eye designer. And then likewise for humanity, right? Watches are complex, they are functional, they are designers. Likewise, they suggest a designer. Likewise, humans or animals or the natural world or eyes are complex and functional, they suggest a designer, right? That's the argument. It's an analogy, right? Arguments from analogy are a kind of inductive argument, right? We've talked about these in class, right? So they're saying, and they're very specific kind of inductive argument. They're saying if you've got two things, in this case, we've got an eye and we've got a watch, right? And we're saying they're alike in certain features, and therefore they should be alike in other features, right? Just as just as watches are complex, so are eyes. Just as watches are functional, so are eyes. Just as watches are designed, so are eyes, right? Just as a watch has a maker, so does an eye, right? That's the kind of thing, right? If you are making an argument from an analogy, the argument is as strong as the analogy is, right? So two things that are analogous should share all their properties in common. When you're making an analogy argument, the more similar the things are, the better the argument is. And the more relevant dissimilarities they have, then the worse the argument is. So somebody evaluating an argument like Paley's, what you'd want to look at is it really the case that a watch is analogous to a human eye? Or is it really a case that a machine is analogous to an animal, right? Or a machine to a universe? And if there's relevant differences, then this argument would start to fall apart, right? But that's the kind of thing that you're asking here. And if they are analogous, then it's a really compelling argument. There's other versions of this argument. Again, probably more modern versions of the design argument will be some sort of abductive argument, right? Again, we said this is likely the default methodology in the sciences, and so it makes sense that you might want to frame this kind of an argument as an abductive argument. So somebody might say something like, there's some part of the world that is designed, right? Or sure looks designed. And so something must have designed those parts, right? Some part of the world is functional, or some part of the world looks like it's designed. It's got the kind of features that suggest design. Given that there's a part of the world that has those kind of features, one explanation might be that something did the designing, right? Something made it have those features. The question is, well, what made it have those features? And then in this style of argument, the person would say, well, one theory is that there's some sort of creator God, and she is the best explanation for how we got things to be the way they are, right? Given design, must be a designer. Could be some other explanation, but the best explanation, says this argument, is that a God did it, right? Therefore, a God exists. More contemporary versions, that's the kind of thing they look at, right? Two really influential versions of this argument. And again, I'm not critiquing any of these arguments in these videos. We're going to do that in class. We're just sort of trying to lay out the kind of arguments here, right? One really influential contemporary version of the design argument is an appeal to irreducible complexity. This comes from Michael Behe, and it comes from the Discovery Institute. They're a think tank that funded a lot of this kind of work. But the irreducible complexity people, what they said is, we're not going to sort of try to, what we really want to do is we want to find like a smoking gun, essentially, in biology, is what they said. They said, we want to look at the biological world, and we want to see if there are any of these features that really do suggest strongly that they were designed, right? And so the irreducible complexity people, they pointed to a couple things, two classic examples, and probably their biggest example was the bacteria flagellum, which is the tail that a bacteria has that allows it to move. And then they also looked at the eye, right? And so Michael Behe does both of these in his work on this stuff. So what he argued is that if you look at the bacteria flagellum, it looks like a really complicated kind of sci-fi machine, right? It's got all these little proteins that are built together essentially to make a propeller that can turn a tail, right? And if you take away, now here's the important part of his claim. He says, if you take away any one of these parts, the bacteria flagellum will stop working. It'll be a useless thing. So it's what he calls an irreducibly complex mechanism, right? And because there's irreducibly complex things in the biological world, argues Michael Behe, there must have been, they either come into existence fully formed, or they must have been built by somebody, right? So his claim is that you can't have something like a bacteria flagellum evolve. Why? He says it's irreducibly complex. He thinks that if evolution via natural selection was creating a bacteria flagellum or an eye or something like that, it would have to do something miraculous. It would have to bring these things into existence fully formed, because they are useless. The parts of the eye or the parts of the bacteria flagellum are useless all on their own. Now, again, this is Behe's argument. And then he's saying, now, the best explanation for how you get things that are irreducibly complex in a natural world, like an eye or like a bacteria flagellum, is a designer, is a god, right? So there's the argument. Really influential, like late 20th century version of this argument. One more type I want to talk about is what's called the fine-tuning argument. So these people, what they'll say is they'll say that, again, the same type of thing, right? The universe suggests design in a way in which that it suggests the existence of some sort of a god, right? And the fine-tuning people would look at all the fundamental constants in our universe, right? They'd say the universe, or at least our corner of it, the part of it that we are aware of, right, seems so perfectly built to accommodate the existence of creatures like humans, right? And the rest of the natural world that we see around us. So much so, in fact, that if you changed even slightly one of several fundamental constants in the universe, and then they'll appeal to things like the strong or weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, gravity, these kind of things, and they'd say, now if you changed even one of those, move the dial even slightly, we would cease to exist. The universe would not be habitable to creatures like us. But yet, the universe is sort of perfectly built for things like us to exist. Well, why? What's the best explanation for a universe perfectly designed for creatures like us to be here? A god. A designer must have been controlling the dials to ensure that we're living in a world that just happens to be a perfect creature like us. So any of these style of arguments are what we call design arguments, right? And again, when we get into class next week, we'll look at these and we'll critically assess them. But there's your design arguments. Have a good one.